When the Federal Arsenal and Armory was constructed at Harpers Ferry, the justification was the surrounding topography made the installation impervious to attack. Frederick Douglass agreed it to be a dangerous place, but in a very different sense, describing it as a perfect steel trap. His phrase was uttered to make John Brown reconsider his raid in 1859, but can also describe the plight of the Union garrison that found themselves there in 1862. In this edition of Retracing History, we'll be exploring the battlefields that led to the near ruin of one of America's most picturesque communities and discover how this perfect steel trap changed the course of the American Civil War. Harpers Ferry was enshrined in the history books as the target of armed abolitionists led by John Brown, but the town was not attacked on a whim by a lone madman. The raid was planned and funded over multiple years. Brown had gained prominence amongst the most radical echelons calling for the abolishment of slavery in the United States. He moved to the Kansas Territory in the mid-1850s at the urging of his sons and participated in guerrilla warfare with pro-slave factions trying to tip the territory's politics in their favor. With no end in sight to bleeding Kansas, Brown brought his tactics east to incite a slave revolt. Though the particulars of how he was going to achieve this are still vague, we know he had a constitution drafted for a provisional government, complete with laws and appointed officials. To arm freed slaves and other supporters, he needed to acquire a large cache of firearms and ammunition. Thus, Harpers Ferry became the first objective in his holy war against slavery, due to being the home of one of two of the nation's federal armories and arsenals.
So the museum we're in is currently in what would be these cluster of buildings. Now, when we go outside, it's a very different perspective. This is all covered by a railroad fill. Now CSX uses that. At the time, you can see the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad came down alongside the Armory grounds. About 20 buildings in the Federal Armory, and then this is the point, or Arsenal Square. These two brick buildings here, these were the Federal Arsenal. So this is actually what Brown's target was, right across the street from us. This was his main goal, because there was about 100,000 firearms in those two buildings. So Brown went to Chatham, Canada in 1858 to try to recruit people for his provisional army. Only one black man actually answered that call, and that was Osborne Perry Anderson. Now, what's interesting about Anderson is he gives one of the eyewitness testimonies of the raid. He'll actually be published in 1861. I believe it's called A Voice from Harpers Ferry. So he became a bit of a noteworthy author after the raid, and I believe he was also in the Union Army at some point. He spent the remainder of his years in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He's one of only the few raiders to successfully escape. So very important to historiography on the John Brown raid. Dangerfield Newby was one of the free former slaves that were in Brown's provisional army, and when he was killed, actually just in the street below us, they found in the pocket a letter from his wife. His wife was still in slavery, and it was Newby's plan to raise funds to purchase her from slavery or liberate her by force through Brown's raid. A lot has changed in Harpers Ferry since that day in October of 1859. For one, that was not there in 1859. It was actually over there. And when I say over there, more about 15 feet underneath the ground. We are standing above the Armory grounds. And there would have been about 20 buildings on either side. We've been in the middle of the original Potomac Street. It's since been moved over there. Buildings on either side, a lane going down. One of the two main armories for the United States government. And his engine house was actually built, not the obelisk, the actual engine house over there. The engine house was actually built during renovations throughout the 1850s to modernize it. That modernization also saw a couple street lights being placed right here around the square. So there was a little bit of lighting the night John Brown came to raid Harpers Ferry. Yep. Now you'll notice over there's two outlines. That is what he was targeting. Those are the arsenal buildings. There's about 100,000 stand of arms stowed away into those two buildings. At least in theory, that's what Brown believed. But yeah, the engine house where he would set up his command post was essentially standing right there the night of the raid. And then the gates would have been right around here. Now, once Brown secures the armory grounds and sets up his command post here, he's going to send John Caggie and I think it was about 2 or 3 of the raiders. They're going to go down Shenandoah Street about a half mile to the Hall Rifle Works. Now, they were famous for back in the early 1800s. John H. Hall set up shop here at Harpers Ferry to produce his breech-loading rifle, and he produced them here from the 1820s till his death in 1841. There also was a bridge somewhere over here that traversed the Shenandoah River, which would have given people access to Loudon Heights. 2 of his raiders were dispatched to take possession of the bridge. All of this was done, taking the armory grounds, taking the arsenal, taking the Shenandoah Bridge, and taking the Hall's Rifle Works. This was all done without firing a shot. The first hour of the raid, very successful for John Brown. So if you see the photograph there, those are the gates to the armory, and on the night of October 16th, from that little gateway there, Brown approached the watchman and basically didn't really ask. He declared that he had taken the United States Armory and Arsenal and had done it without firing a shot. Well, these are those gates of the photograph today. The segment of the entrance was preserved by the family of Alexander Murphy, and as such is one of the only surviving pieces of the armory. The whole armory was razed during the American Civil War. So this is the engine house behind me. I mentioned a little earlier, would have been few yards across the road in the old armory grounds. It's since been relocated here. It's been here since the 1950s. Now, this is where Brown had his communications base on the night of October 16th. And when things go sour on October 17th, the raiders, or at least those that are still surviving, are going to fall back within this structure. Now, the structure is actually reversed to its original construction. So there's a small storeroom that you'll see behind me in this doorway. That would have been on the opposite side when in the original structure. Then this side here, these 2 bays would have historically been the original, where the actual fire engines were stowed. So it's mirrored, but it is the bricks of the original. Now you might be asking, what was actually standing here? Well, there were scores of businesses. This is downtown Harpers Ferry, so that is where the armory grounds were. Of course, you know the obelisk, that's where the engine house would have been. There would have been the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Station, and you would have had, I believe, the Wagger House. There's the Wagger House and the Galt House. 2 hotels are in downtown. The other hotel would have been somewhere in this vicinity, and there would have been other buildings. So a lot of cover for civilians and later militia to gather around and pour a crossfire upon the engine house. Some of the first shots of the raid would have been fired a few blocks down the street there at one of the corners. There was a grocer who stepped out, big burly man. I think his name was Thomas Borrow. Edit that. That's the wonder of editing. The grocer stepped out and with his pistol started firing. Up here, Dangerfield Newby would return fire and would actually kill the grocer. And it wouldn't be too long later, Newby and 2 of the other raiders were sent to guard the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Bridge. Again, you have to keep in mind the original bridge was a covered bridge behind me. They were meant to guard it. Well, one of the militia units actually throughout the morning of October 17th cut across Bolivar Heights, crossed Camp Hill, traversed the Potomac River. So they're on the Maryland side, came down the Maryland side of the Potomac River, and then came across the Baltimore Ohio Bridge, pushing those free raiders back here into Arsenal Square. And this is around the point where things start falling apart for Brown's raiders. And as they're falling back to the engine house, Newby will actually be killed. He's the first raider to be killed. And later on during the day, as the crowd gets more and more aggressive, they actually mutilate his body here in the streets. So the pike there is one of the 1,000 original ones that Brown ordered. And though a few were issued out, I don't think any actually ever saw combat. Nevertheless, the various militia units that responded to the raid, they took them as souvenirs. So there's an inscription somewhere up there on the top. Oh, no, actually, I can see. You won't be able to see in the lighting, but it's right there on the shaft. That's an inscription by, I presume, one of the militiamen that took this as a souvenir. Wow. And then down below, at least the Park Service is saying that is Brown's 1853 model Sharps rifle that he used during the raid. And underneath is Aaron Stevens' Sharps. When Brown started to realize that he was all but trapped here in Harpers Ferry. He tried to start negotiating passage across the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Bridge. He's actually going to send William Thompson out, one of his raiders, under a flag of truce with one of the hostages. Well, they apprehend Thompson and basically put him in under guard here over in the Wagner house. Now, he's going to try again. One of Brown's sons is going to step out with a second raider, with a second hostage. When these two guys step out, they're actually fired upon. The hostage wasn't hit, but Brown's son was mortally wounded. The other raider was killed. And as the day went on, the mayor of Harpers Ferry, Fonte Beckham, was starting to walk around the streets trying to figure out what was going on. He was starting to observe the shooting from a water tower that would have been by the Baltimore, Ohio train station. He can look into the engine house. One of the raiders thought that it was an armed civilian and shot the mayor. The mayor of Harpers Ferry was dead because of this raid. Enraged, people stormed the Wagner house, grabbed William Thompson. And I've actually read that one of the civilians, what ended up happening was one of the militiamen was actually a nephew of Fontaine Beckham, was outraged that his uncle had been killed out here in the streets. Goes in there, grabs William Thompson. Now, one of the civilians, a lady whose name I sadly forget the time, I'll have to edit in, she tried to intervene, tried to save Thompson's life, but she could not succeed against the crowd. They dragged Thompson, took him up to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Bridge, and executed him, throwing his body down into the river below.
With the railroad bridge firmly in militia hands, Brown had no means of escape. Throughout October 17th, he and the few surviving raiders tried to hold out within the engine house, hoping to negotiate their way out of the valley. But by the morning of the 18th, a detachment of the United States Marine Corps had arrived on the scene, with Colonel Robert E. Lee placed in overall charge of the situation. After one final failed attempt to negotiate, Lee allowed for Lieutenant Israel Green to lead a dozen Marines in assaulting the engine house. To avoid injuring hostages inside, Green and his Marines attacked with a ladder, sledgehammers, and bayonets.
Yeah, so when the Marines stormed the fire engine house, they didn't want to use their firearms. They didn't want to shoot any of the hostages, so they went in with sledgehammers like this one and attempted to bust down the engine house doors like those back there. A little difficult because they were crouched very low, trying to head to the lower half because Brown had cut loopholes in the upper half shooting out. And eventually they decided to give up on the sledgehammer and grab a ladder instead.
Green's assault on the engine house was brief but effective. All raiders inside were casualties at the cost of one Marine life. Brown had managed to survive, for Green's parade sword that day bent when it struck the abolitionist's belt buckle. An injured Brown would eventually be jailed and tried in nearby Charlestown on treason against the state of Virginia. Brown used his time in court and jail to affirm his stance on slavery, making himself both a martyr in the North and an omen for things to come in the South.
These are remains of a scaffold that was located on the grounds where John Brown was hung, so very likely these could be parts of the gallows.
Brown had failed to start a holy war against slavery, but had managed to push the country even closer to a full-scale civil war. Militias were organized throughout Virginia and other southern states shortly after the raid, for fear of slave revolts orchestrated by northern influence. Harpers Ferry was vastly developing into a steel trap for its residents as war clouds covered the nation. In April of 1861, the American Civil War began in earnest in South Carolina. Soon, pro-secession militias were on the move across the South. One band set their sights upon the federal arsenal and armory, then only guarded by 40 federal soldiers. With no way of holding off the incoming militias, the federal garrison decided to set fire to the buildings to prevent rebel forces from using the equipment and arms.
I love this illustration. This is from early in the war in 1861 when the federal forces set fire to the armory complex so the Confederates couldn't capture it. A Port Creighton of Harper's Weekly, he got this illustration. I think this is Bolivar Heights, which is shrouding the flames, but you can see the eerie glow of that coming overhead. So if you see what I mean by, that must have been really eerie. Maybe it's actually Camp Bill, but God, that would have been an eerie sight.
Oh yeah, seeing it down on the, ooh, yeah.
The raising of federal property was just the first devastating blow the Civil War made to Harpers Ferry, due to rail lines from Winchester, Cumberland, and Washington, D.C. all converging at the ferry. It was of utmost importance for either the Union or Confederates to occupy the area. Both sides would exchange control of the ferry, though much of the time it was manned by a Union garrison.
So this was once the home of Frederick Roeder, and next door he had his bake shop. He lost his wife just before the American Civil War started in 1861. He was a Unionist, and at the time in early 1861, the town was held by the Confederates, so he wanted to see the Union flag flying from the Maryland side of the rivers. Well, one time he tried to go out and get a peek, and unfortunately, a Union soldier mistook him as a Confederate soldier and killed him. He was the first Harpers Ferry resident to be killed during the Civil War. The Reverend Dr. Josiah P. Smeltzer laid the cornerstone of St. John Lutheran's Church April 30th of 1850. The building was completed 2 years later and dedicated in August of 52. A little more than 7 years had passed when, at dawn on October 17, 1859, local physician John D. Starry ordered the church bell to be rung to alert Harpers Ferry that John Brown's raid was underway. Many residents fled the town proper and gathered at the church. Smeltzer, the church's pastor, wrote in his diary, "I have never witnessed such a fright in any community as when the news fled that the abolitionists of the North had taken the armory and were killing our people." 2 years after shots were fired in Harpers Ferry, the Civil War began. Services here were soon suspended as federal forces took over the church and used it as a hospital. During the Battle of Harpers Ferry in September of 1862, a Confederate cannonball fired from Maryland Heights struck and shattered part of the wall. The signs of repair are still visible. After the war, the church was slowly rendered fit for service and resumed in 1869. In 1998, dissension divided the congregation and the church was closed. It reopened in 1928 and remains in operation to this day. The church's interior remains intact with the original pews in place. The church bell that rang on October 17, 1859 is accessed from the balcony. Wow.
That's right.
That is cool. This Napoleon is parked on the property of West Virginia Oddfellows Lodge number 1. Now this structure actually stood during the Armory's existence. It was built during the restoration, we say, of the Army back in the 1850s. And then during the war, this was relatively spaced out. There were a few buildings up here at the Lutheran Church we saw on the way down. But it was relatively spaced out, no real trees up here, and this was, well, called Camp Hill. We mentioned at Jefferson's Rock, they call it Camp Hill because this is where they had the U.S. Army camp in 1799 during the building of the Armory. Well, during the American Civil War, they did the same thing here. So this is where Union soldiers, and I believe also Confederate soldiers, would have had encampments throughout the war, and definitely would have been camped here during the Battle of Harpers Ferry. So it's kind of hard to see, but for this position over there is Bolivar Heights, and beyond that would have been the Confederate line on Schoolhouse Ridge. So I wasn't even paying attention until a humble collector pointed out, but they're talking about the graffiti that's on the wall. And this was from a private W.H. Schuster. He was a member of the Philadelphia Fire Zouaves, garrison the town.
They wore very colorful uniforms.
So I'm unsure if this is the room, the very room that they're talking about, but this room is designed today to depict what was called the Sky Parlor. So James E. Taylor was an illustrator and war correspondent. He worked for Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper, one of the biggest illustrated newspapers in the country at the time. And he came here in 1864 to cover the Shenandoah Valley campaign. He obtained lodging at Mrs. Cornelia Stipe's boarding house in what he called a sky parlor under the slanting roof. So I'm going to guess this is just because of how the roof is shaped. So this is at least depicting and potentially is where Taylor was boarded during his time being here as a war correspondent. He recorded his room as being the thermometer ranged in the 90s in my loft. They proceeded to put a number of special subjects in ship shape amid perspiration oozing from my pores without a let up. Oh God.
Yeah, that sounds miserable.
Looks nice though.
Although skirmishing was occasional whenever a Confederate force drew near, garrison life in Harpers Ferry was typically mundane. A wide area of units moved in and out of the ranks of what was informally known as the Railroad Brigade. Some of the ranks were merely federalized militiamen, such as the 22nd New York State Militia, who came to be found in a variety of photographs taken at Harpers Ferry during the summer of 1862. Others were newly minted regiments such as the 126th New York, who were just getting field experience when stationed at the ferry in September of that year. While the Railroad Brigade would swell to 14,000 soldiers, lack of experience and a peculiar commander would soon affix their legacies to one of the United States' greatest military blunders. In the late summer of 1862, the Confederate armies went on multiple large-scale offensives. The most notable was the plan to drive north across the Potomac River with Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. To succeed in this mission, Lee would need to neutralize a Union garrison at Harpers Ferry, commanded by Colonel Dixon Miles, which threatened the rear of his march. This campaign would eventually lead to America's bloodiest single day, but would also lead to the largest surrender of Union soldiers during the war.
So this is a breakdown of the Union defenders of Harpers Ferry during the battle. There's Colonel Dixon Miles. Now, it might seem a little weird that a colonel's commanding about 12,000 soldiers. There is a reason for it. Before the war, he was one of only 10 field officers in the United States Regulars. He was in charge of the 2nd Regular Infantry. As such, his rank, at least I believe, had more superiority over your brevet commanders that were made commanders during the war. And assisting him is General Frederick Diutasi, Colonel William Trimble. I wonder if he's related to the Trimble that's with the Army of Northern Virginia. And then Colonel William Ward, who was right on Camp Hill. We also got Colonel Thomas Ford defending Maryland Heights. Interesting breakdown.
I didn't realize this is where they found Order 191.
Not here, it was actually near Frederick. So this breaks down Jackson's plan of attack. So Jackson had about 2/3 of the Army of North Virginia with him, and his plan was to surround Harpers Ferry from 3 sides, which, think, you're moving a large Confederate force with limited supplies on 3 different sides of 3 different bodies of water, simultaneously. Pretty darn impressive that he was able to achieve it, but he did. And what ended up happening was he put Lafayette McLaw's division on top of Maryland Heights to contest with the Union troops defending it. Then he moved John Walker onto Loudon Heights, and Walker was unopposed. Colonel Miles didn't see any value in Loudon Heights, so he basically let the Confederates have it. And then General Jackson brought his force, which consisted of A.P. Hill's division, put him on Schoolhouse Ridge. Miles had the bulk of the Union line on Bolivar Heights, so Jackson was facing off with the Union line about a mile apart from each other. In any case, they were trapped, Miles and the Union soldiers. So when I was doing research, one of the segments of the battle I could not find a lot of was on the Battle of Maryland Heights. Not a lot of people talk about it. They consider it a minor skirmish, but when I was listening to talks by former park ranger Dennis Fry, I realized there was a much greater action. Here's a map of it. So we got Barksdale's Mississippians, and Barksdale would be killed at the Battle of Gettysburg next year, as well as Kershaw's brigade of South Carolinians assaulted the New York and Ohio regiments that were protecting the heights. And they could see they had a abattis, which essentially is that you take a bunch of sticks and you sharpen them on the edge. It sounds crude, but it's very effective. And then they had actually a second fallback position should they get dislodged, which ultimately happened. And they're talking about here the 126th New York were one of the regiments that held out, and actually the Union Army, they had to relocate a few times on the heights, but they did hold the heights throughout September 14th. But by the end of the day, Miles called them down from the hill. Kind of realized what was about to happen and didn't want to get them stuck on top of the heights. But the 126th New York that was up there on September 14th, well, their flag is right here. So this gives you a very good idea of what the Battle of Harpers Ferry truly looked like. So we're standing on Bolivar Heights, and Dixon Miles' strategy was he felt he had 48 hours he could hold out before he got reinforcements. So he was actually confident that he could hold out for 2 days, but he sent anybody, he's like, find anybody in a blue coat and tell them we're in trouble. Anybody, I don't care if it's
anybody you can get.
I'll take anybody. In the intermediate time, he set up the bulk of his army, about 14,000 men, were lined up along Bolivar Heights, which straddles the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. Facing him was 1/3 of Jackson's force. Now, Jackson collectively had 26,000 Confederates surrounding Harpers Ferry, so Jackson greatly outnumbers Miles. But to be fair to Miles,
he has a pretty darn good defensive position. And what you'll see shortly when we go to the other side of Bolivar Heights, there was no trees here. In 1862, this was all flat, well, all open. If it was flat, it would be a little easier for Jackson. Jackson has to traverse about 1,000 yards of open ground and then assault a 200-foot ascent, which is guarded by thousands of Union soldiers and Union cannon. So just because Jackson has surrounded Harpers Ferry does not automatically mean he got it by the bag. And time is running out. On September 14th, 1862, McClellan is going to attack the remaining third of Lee's army up on South Mountain. So the plan to divide in the army of Northern Virginia has been compromised. So Jackson got to finish this up very shortly. We're on the west face of Bolivar Heights. Behind me would have been Dixon Miles' Union soldiers who were pretty well situated on top of the heights. And across is Schoolhouse Ridge, and that's where Jackson set up the Confederate Army on the night of September 13th going into September 14th. Now, that is about 1,000 yards away. Jackson's predicament is, if he wants to assault this frontally, he has to come across open ground. No real trees would have been here at the time of the battle. He had to come across open ground to assault these positions, which are all cut. No trees were up there in September of 1862. So if we were here right now, we'd be in perfect range of some of those cannons up there.
Nice.
Yeah, we wouldn't be. Turkey couldn't live on this field. So Jackson's plan to not attack frontally was to attack frontally at nighttime. Yes, so there's a little bit of a three-pronged strategy here. The first strategy is he is going to make a feint on the Union center where we're standing. So he's going to bring troops across the valley behind us, but he's not going to get too close. He doesn't want to get his men shot to pieces. That'll distract Miles and the Union troops thinking they're getting frontally attacked. That is going to allow not only for artillery, additional artillery to be set up on Maryland and Loudon Heights, but that's also going to allow Jackson to transfer troops, about 5,000 Confederate troops, to the south here, get around Bolivar Heights, kind of shimmy their way across the heights, and then put them on the farm of the Chambers family. And if he achieves this overnight, once of all, that's just a significant engineering feat, moving all that equipment in the dark on sheer cliffs, essentially. What he'll also achieve, he'll be able to have enfilading fire on the Union left flank. So imagine it's the morning of September 15th. You wake up, you're expecting to see the Confederates still at Schoolhouse Ridge. Then you look to your left, and over there in the clearing, you see many Confederate cannon and about 5,000 Confederate soldiers ready to open fire and outflank you. After the 1-hour artillery bombardment upon Harpers Ferry from all three sides, Miles conferred with his staff. It didn't take much for him to reach the decision that they're completely trapped. There's just not enough time for McClellan to send reinforcements to break the siege. It's best to save their lives to surrender. Now, while Miles and the staff agreed to surrender, many of the Union soldiers were frustrated. They had felt that they'd only seen the feint of the Confederate the night of September 14th, that feint attack to distract them from the relocation of Confederate troops and artillery on their flank. They felt they didn't even got a chance to prove their honor in the field, and that Miles was giving up without firing a shot. This is unhonorable. And in fact, one soldier was so disgusted that he said he had no country anymore as a result. Now, the reason I bring this up, there is some dispute over what happens next. So Miles comes riding up. I don't know exactly if he got here to Bolivar Heights, but he's coming back out here to tell the bulk of his army to stand down. The battle's over. We've surrendered officially, give the formal announcement. Well, cannon fire is still occurring between both sides. And next thing somebody knows, Miles is slumping in the saddle of his horse. He has taken, I believe it was to the foot. He took the wound to the foot and was bleeding pretty badly. Now, some people, the legend is that he was shot by a spent ball from the Union side, that in modern terms he had been fragged. Now there's a lot of contention over this. A lot of historians do not believe this theory, and
I'm not saying I believe it, but it's just something to throw out in the fog of war, what had happened, and showing just how disgusted the troops were at Miles, that people believed for many years that's what happened. What probably happened, it was probably a piece of shrapnel from that artillery bombardment happening back and forth, probably what hit him. And he would die the next day, September 16th, 1862. Ultimately, General Julius White was sent to Squaw's Ridge to formally surrender to General Jackson. And in total, look what the Confederates ended up with. 73 cannon, 13,000 small arms, 200 wagons, and then a 12,500 prisoners, which is the largest surrender of federal troops during the American Civil War, and will be the largest surrender by a United States Army until Bataan during the Second World War.
Boys, he's not much for looks, but if we'd had him, we wouldn't have been caught in this trap. Jackson. In his gray, dingy suit.
So behind me is an old boat ramp that was here during the American Civil War. It was actually the scene of not one, but two daring escapes during the Battle of Harpers Ferry. That's that battle during the Maryland campaign that occurred here and led to the largest federal surrender during the war. So on September 14th, about 1,000 cavalrymen were able to dash across a pontoon bridge that was strung behind me to the Maryland side of the Potomac River, and were able to get out of the valley before the Confederates closed their trap. Now, the next day when the Army surrenders, down here were a group of black laborers that were working for the Union Army. And they were approached by the Confederates, and the Confederates started grabbing them and declaring that they were taking back possession of their slaves. Now, the Union colonel down there, I believe it was a Colonel Trimble, said, "You can't do this. They're they're civilian laborers. You know, they're not part of the Army." And what Trimble was actually doing was actually causing a bit of distraction. And all of a sudden, it gives the order for everybody, all the laborers, to go forward march, and they dash across the Potomac River and get to the Maryland side to safety.
Though Jackson had just achieved the most complete field victory of his career, there was little time to enjoy it. By September 15th, Robert E. Lee was pinned down by the Union Army of the Potomac near Sharpsburg, Maryland. Having to move quickly, the terms of surrender of the Harpers Ferry garrison paroled the Union soldiers on the grounds they would be detained until a future prisoner exchange. Many of these parolees found their way to Chicago's Camp Douglas, notorious to historians today as the North's equivalent to Andersonville. Most were only detained for 2 months, but the men of the 65th Illinois Regiment were detained for guard duty until April of 1863. To add salt to the wound, this unit had been organized at Camp Douglas. However, they would have their revenge when transferred to the Western Theater, fighting at battles such as Franklin and Nashville before war's end. Harpers Ferry would return to Union hands after the Battle of Antietam and continued being a critical rail hub for the war effort. The Union garrison would evacuate during the Gettysburg Campaign of 1863, hoping to avoid a repeat of the surrender. In 1864, General Philip Sheridan would arrive to use the rail lines to funnel soldiers and supplies into his newly formed Army of the Shenandoah, a force that would come to consist of 50,000 men-at-arms. Sheridan's headquarters, Lockwood Manor, remained standing on Camp Hill. Sheridan would advance out of Harpers Ferry into the Shenandoah Valley, depriving the Confederacy of its breadbasket for the remainder of the war.
What we're looking at right now, actually, for once, it's shown up on camera. These are earthworks dug by Union soldiers here in Bolivar Heights. Now, I don't know if these earthworks were dug during the battle in 1862 or were later dug when Philip Sheridan used Harpers Ferry as his supply depot for his Shenandoah Valley campaign. In any case, if that's how deep they are today, imagine how formidable they must have been back during the Civil War. So this wayside is confirming this is post-battle. In October of 1862, when the Union reoccupied Harpers Ferry, they improved the fortifications so it would not fall to Confederate hands again. And in fact, during the earthwork construction, President Lincoln showed up to review the troops up here. Now, Bolivar Heights was also a site of Union and Confederate encampments for the duration of the American Civil War. So we're talking about the battle here in September of 1862. Keep in mind, this is a historic site for the entire duration of the conflict. And, well, near the end of the war, people's nerves were running out on hanging around with the Army. Even though we know today that the Union were not too far from winning the war, in December of 1864, these guys couldn't see it that way. Lee is still firmly entrenched around Petersburg. The Confederates aren't really budging. And, well, it says here that 2 Union deserters were caught and were executed here on Bolivar Heights. William Lodge, convicted of being a deserter, bushwhacker, murderer, and assassin, wow, was hanged from a gallows near this spot December 2nd, 1864. Exactly 5 years after abolition of John Brown's hanging in nearby Charlestown.
It's just an unlucky day around here, I guess.
Yeah. 3 months later, on March 3rd, 1865, Thomas Murphy of the 6th U.S. Cavalry died here at the hand of a firing squad. So there was an execution by hanging and an execution by firing squad here. In April 65, the war ended and the nation began to heal. But Bolivar Heights also healed as soldiers returned home, and the Union remains were moved to the National Cemetery in Winchester, Virginia. Today, only shallow remnants of the once formidable fortifications remain here on Bolivar Heights.
The American Civil War came to an end in spring of 1865. Harpers Ferry's pre-war integrity was devastated. However, its place in the history books would eventually save its remains a century later by being designated a national park. The battlefields of Harpers Ferry are now tools in educating the public about our shared past. If one does not learn from Harpers Ferry's past, they too may find themselves in a perfect steel trap. Thank you for watching this episode of Retracing History. If you enjoyed exploring these sites with me, be sure to hit the like button. If you want to follow me on future adventures, subscribe to the channel. If you want to go the extra mile and support me, a link in my Ko-fi page is in the description below. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.